Good afternoon, good morning, dear colleagues. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christian Herpfer. I am the president of the World Values Survey Association. The event today is a new tradition. In 2022, the World Values Survey Association has created a new tradition, an annual honorary lecture where we commemorate the memory and scientific legacy of the founder of the World Values Survey, Professor Ronald F. Inglehart. And today, on December 8th, we have the second annual lecture to present. I'm very pleased to see so many colleagues coming to our 23 lectures today. Professor Ronald Inglehart, one of the most famous and influential political scientists of our generation, has of no doubt been a source of inspiration to many. Ronald F. Inglehart was the founder and the first president of the world famous World Values Survey for more than 30 years, from 1981 to 2013. He created and directed the World Values Survey, which developed and expanded thanks to his outstanding academic leadership to the biggest social science survey research program in the world. Together with the WVSA as a research program, Ron Inglehart created also the biggest social survey infrastructure in academic survey research, with national teams of leading scholars in more than 120 countries and societies in all continents around the globe. The biggest survey research program in the social sciences worldwide had its institutional academic base and center at the University of Michigan under the leadership of Ron Inglehart, who served as Löwenstein Professor of Political Science, as well as research professor at the Center for Political Studies during his success story as a true giant of modern political and social sciences in this excellent American university. Ron is one of the most cited political scientists in the world, with more than 140,000 citations in other academic publications, an age index of 120, and an I-10 index of 369. An age index of 120 means that his publication record represents the equivalent and accumulated age index of 6 full professors of politics in the UK. Based at the University of Michigan, Ron developed an international cooperation with leading universities like Harvard University, Princeton University in the USA, University of Cambridge, University of Southampton, King's College London, Australian National University in Canberra, University of Sydney and University of Melbourne in Australia, Lausanne University and Free University Berlin in Germany, University Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, University of Jordan, Catholic University in Uruguay, University of Bucharest, University of Warsaw, University of Vienna, Institute for Future Studies in Sweden, University of Almería in Spain, Istanbul universities, and many dozens of other famous universities and institutes around the globe. Ron Inglehart was not only directing a huge global research program with now more than 600,000 successful face-to-face interviews in 120 countries and societies worldwide. He published almost every year an academic book, and his most recent book was published in 2021. His influential and famous as well as best-selling books have been translated into many world languages and have been used in hundreds of universities, in undergraduate and postgraduate teaching and learning of thousands of students on all continents. It is our greatest honor and noble duty to continue the great vocation and mission of Ron Inglehart, to support, develop, and multiply his legacy in the fields of social and political sciences. To commemorate the scientific legacy of Ron Inglehart and his fundamental contribution into the values and political culture research, the World Values Survey Association has announced this new prize, the annual lecture that will carry the name of our respected founder. We are extremely grateful for the generous and long-term financial support of the prestigious new prize, Professor Marita Inglehart, who will give some introduction statement very soon, from the University of Michigan, who was supporting Ron over many decades as his wife and soulmate. And we would like also to express our deep gratitude to the whole Inglehart family. Many of his colleagues and family are in presence today. Now I would like to ask Professor Marita Inglehart to give her presentation in memory of Professor Ronald Inglehart. Marita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian, for giving me an opportunity to say a few words. I won't make a presentation, but I want to thank you very much for doing this yearly lecture. Ron would absolutely love it, and he would also love that one of his former students, Amaney, is giving the lecture. I also think that he would appreciate the topic that you talk about, Amaney, very much. We have a scholarship fund at the University of Michigan in his name. And this last summer, the first graduate student went to Africa and collected data on poverty in Africa. And so hearing your lecture and then knowing that the student is actually working on it is really very gratifying. I only want to mention one more thing. When you said that he published so much, his publications are rolling in again. At the beginning of February, his book will be out that he co-edited with Dr. Zhang about China as #1 ? And I can't wait to see this book as the last book that one contributed to coming out next year. So thank you very much for organizing this lecture in the name of our whole family. And thank you very much, Amaney, for talking today.
Thank you so much, Professor Inglehart. And thank you for your continuing support of the World Values Survey Association by giving these prestigious prizes for the best lecture of the year and the best book, which will be presented next year. Thank you very much. This year, the prestigious winner of the Ronald Inglehart Annual Lecture Prize is Professor Amaney Jamal from Princeton University in the USA. Amaney Jamal is Dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. She is Edward S. Sanford Professor of Politics, as well as Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. She's also the former director of the Mamdouha S. Probst Center for Peace and Justice. Jamal also directs the workshop on Arab political development and the Probst American University of Beirut Collaborative Initiative. Her book, Barriers to Democracy from 2007, which explores the role of civic associations in promoting democratic effects in the Arab world, won the 2008 American Political Science Association Best Book Award in the Comparative Democratization section. The other books include Of Empires and Citizens and her co-edited volume on Americans before and after 9/11. Jamal's articles have been published in top journals like American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Conflict Resolution, Comparative Politics, Perspectives on Politics, International Migration Review, and many other top journals in politics and political science. The article, Does Islam Play a Role in Anti-Immigrant Sentiment, an Experimental Approach in Social Science Research 2015, won the 2016 Louis Wirth Best Article Award of the American Sociological Association in the International Migration section of ASA. Jamal is the co-principal of the Arab Barometer Project, which is the winner of the best data set in the field of comparative politics with the Leipart-Krzyzewski-Werber Dataset Award of APSA in 2010. In 2006, Jamal was named a Carnegie Scholar. She holds a PhD from the University of Michigan, the same university where Ron was leading so many years. Her areas of specialization are the Middle East, North Africa, MENA, mass and political behavior, political development and democratization, inequality and economic segregation, Muslim integration into US and Europe, gender, race, religion, and class. So she's a true global scholar with an enormous portfolio. The topic of Professor Jamal's lecture today is the global segregation of the poor. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Jamal to leave the lecture, but after the lecture, in the remaining time, we'll have a question-answer section with the audience. Hence, if you have a general or specific question to Professor Jamal, please raise your hand during the Q&A. Alternatively, you can use the chat function to post your questions during her talk, leave your message. Professor Jamal, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian, and thank you, Marita, for the wonderful introduction and for the invitation. It's a great honor and privilege to be here. As all of you know, I'm Ron Inglehart's former student. He's a mentor, a colleague, and a friend throughout all these years. So there's no better and greater sort of honor than to be presenting this lecture today. And so today I'm presenting a work in progress. This is a new book project called The Global Segregation of the Poor. And in many ways, it's influenced by Ron's work on post-materialist values, on the work that looks at how institutional structures influence public opinion attitudes within societies, and how poverty and per capita GDP correlate with some of the outcomes linked to democracy and democratization. What does it mean for a vibrant post-materialist society more generally? And so in many ways, Ronald Inglehart is present in this work as I'm developing it. So, and it's just a wonderful opportunity to be here with all of you, the World Values Survey community, a community that I hold dear and have been influenced by, and have learned so much from this community and continue to do so. So with that, I'm going to turn over to my presentation. I'm going to share my screen and start the presentations. So the book project is called The Global Segregation of the Poor. And it starts with the premise that what we're witnessing globally, especially in the United States and other OECD countries, is that increasingly the poor people in the world are living in more concentrated, impoverished areas. We see this in our data, especially when we're mapping out geographic data on where poverty is located within our societies. We see that the poor are increasingly living in poor areas and the rich are increasingly living in richer areas. So studies across the developing world also tell us in some parts of the non-OECD world that we see some similar patterns. For example, this is Brazil, where you see the favelas. These are like your concentrated camps or areas of poverty alongside high rises, rich enclaves that are for the rich, but that there's segregation between the rich and the poor. So why does what I call here residential segregation or residential income segregation, why does this matter for any society? It matters because if the poor are always going to be concentrated in poor areas, it means, and the rich in rich areas, it means that societies will have unequal opportunity for the children. A child born in a poor area will have different set of opportunities, whether it's schooling, parks, recreation, libraries, and there's all these other sort of second order consequences, crime, poverty, drugs, etc. And the rich will have another set of opportunities. So in residential income segregation disadvantages future generations. It is almost impossible for these poor people who live in concentrated poverty to catch up. It also limits redistribution. Part of the sort of social contract in most of our democracies is that there is some level of redistribution to the poor, that the rich are taxed, so we have redistribution. But when we think about local tax regimes, if the rich are being taxed in rich areas, that money is being redistributed to improve, to make public improvements in rich areas. When you look at concentrated poverty, the poor are not necessarily a vibrant tax base. So when you tax them, there's not much taxes. So then the taxes can't sort of sustain public goods in ways that will sort of matter. So, and I'm not saying anything new here, just like on this point. This has been a key sort of theoretical and thematic area of study among sociologists. Doug Macy, political scientist. Bob Putnam just wrote a book about the future of our children. Economists like Chetty have all written about the consequences of income residential segregation. From where I work, as you know, I specialize in the politics of the Middle East. So I began to see also that these segregation projects, these economic segregation projects, are emerging in the context of the Middle East. So when we look at Palestine, and when I refer here to Palestine, I mean the West Bank and Gaza, you see that even in a place like Palestine that still lives under Israeli occupation, that you begin to see economic segregation. So here, I draw your attention to this new city that's being created, that was created outside of the main urban center of Ramallah. And this new urban city called Rawabi was designed to be a middle-class enclave that has basically new stores, Western stores that come in with coffee, cappuccino and mochas and areas of middle-class sort of luxury. You have a safari in the middle of this new city of Rawabi. You even have an amphitheater. But this is really for those who have the wealth to afford to live in this area. I like to say that one of the better things that came out of Rawabi is that there was a quota that 30% of all the engineers had to be female. So it gave a lot of women opportunities to work on this new project. But we also see this in Beirut, where you have a lot of high rises alongside concentrated poverty. So here in Arabic, it says, because the rich want to see the skies from their high rises, we, the poor people, can't even see the sky anymore. Sorry, because the rich want to see the sea, we, the poor, cannot see the sky. So again, this idea of how economic segregation is playing out in the Middle East, and just to give you some really quick examples, here's New Cairo. That's another sort of kind of economic segregation project that is, it will benefit rich Egyptians. Zanata, Casablanca, Morocco, Tunisia, Economic City, Abdali, Amman, Jordan. So you see these projects happening in the Middle East as well. Okay. When we look at the United States, again, this is not just a story about the Middle East. Just really quickly across time, when we look at the census data, and there's this really sort of, I think it's a little bit of complicated formula that measures economic segregation, but it's the one that the US Census data uses. I'll show you that in a bit. But you can see when we ask, to what extent is the US population exposed to poverty in their neighborhoods, you'll see that across the board, across all geographic areas in the US, exposure to the poor is on the decline, meaning that we, as more middle class and upper middle class citizens, we are less likely to encounter the poor in our daily lives. Why? Because the poor are sort of living in different areas completely. So I always like to say, we live in Princeton, New Jersey. For those of you who know the United States, there's a lot of poverty in Trenton, which is only 5 miles away, but there's very little exposure between, between Princeton and Trenton, Ann Arbor, for Michigan, and let's say Ypsilanti or Detroit. So we can begin to think about how this works in all our societies. Okay, and this is just I want to sort of also emphasize that it's this growing level of economic segregation in the United States is not simply a story about race per se. It has a racial logic, and I'm going to get to that. But you see that almost every poor population increasingly is seeing more economic segregation. So when we look at 2009 to 2013 on the census data, you'll see that across time, Hispanic population is more economically segregated. The Black population is more economically segregated. The white population is more economically segregation. And here are the total levels of economic segregation. So the research question for the project, the book project, asks, why is the economic segregation of the poor puzzling to begin with? So I have some theoretical sort of theoretical story that comes out of our canonical understandings of poverty and the poor. And then what are the roots of economic segregation, and why is it proliferating in this particular moment in our history? And then how does economic segregation benefit capital and disadvantage the poor? Okay, so why is economic segregation a puzzle, especially for a comparativist who works on public opinion? It's puzzling for a variety of reasons. And just on the political opinion side, I often like to say, when things are held in equilibria, when you have societies, right, where you see growing economic segregation, it is imperative to understand what the political opinions underlying this process, is there support for this? Is there tacit support? So kind of trying to understand what holds this equilibrium together at the micro foundations, which is at the population level. But why is this puzzling? let's look back at our theoretical canons. When we think about theories of state formation, when we think about how to create effective states, historically and traditionally, those accounts were about how do you assert elite hegemony over impoverished populations. In other words, when we wanted to create states back in our, at least theoretical models, whether we're thinking about Tilly or Scott or Olson or Bloch and others, the struggle of creating effective states is to have established elites in power and citizens compliant with the ruling authority. Why is it important for the poor to be dominated, if you may, by an elite state? Well, the poor have always been important in our accounts of state formation because they're important for a source of labor, they're important for a source of taxes, they're important for conscription, and they're important for compliance because you don't want your poor to be revolting. The mechanisms of control typically with the poor is that there has to be some, for the state, you coerce, but you also redistribute. Through the two mechanisms of coercion and redistribution, you ensure sort of compliance. And certainly the poor shouldn't be left on their own for fear of revolt. So when the poor, you go back to Theta Skopje, when you look at the underpinnings of social revolutions, it's always, the bigger threat has always been from the agrarian poor and the peasants. If they are left alone, that those revolts would be far more devastating to the social and political structure because you have a lot of uninhibited or uncontrolled collective action that can be steered towards the state. What I also like to show in the book I've been working on, and I'm not a historical sort of archaeologist or anything of that sort, but what I show in the book is that even going back to ancient Mesopotamia and going back to the earliest cities, you see that there was always this logic of the walled city, whether it's ancient Jericho, this is the city-state of Ur in ancient Mesopotamia. The idea of the walled city, of course, was one about protection, but when you read about how these cities formed, it was critical to bring labor into the city. It was critical to bring soldiers who would become part of the security apparatus into the city. So there were efforts by these states to always bring in the poor people or the peasants in the hinterlands, if you may, and bring them into the city because you needed the poor, of course, to be the base of the future state. But I also argue in terms of comparative politics, we have a Goldilocks approach to the poor, right? Which is that you don't want to be too close to them in terms of thinking about the models because you have to constantly redistribute or they revolt, but you also don't want them to be too far because if they're too far, they can also collectivize and launch an attack on the state. So it's always this, yes, you need the poor, and it's been this sort of trade-off between how much do you want to redistribute and how much do you want to coup-proof, right? In order to keep the ability of the state to extract from the poor, but not capitulate to the poor. So segregation or economic segregation, I argue in the book, actually relieves elites of redistributive pressures, right? When the poor are not living in your neighborhoods, when the poor are living far away, you don't have to redistribute to them. You don't have to share your roads with them. You don't have to share your public goods in your schools. You don't have to pay taxes that will go to the poor, except at the federal level. So segregation actually relieves this pressure of redistribution. And as economic segregation is growing today, the question then becomes, how is economic segregation growing in the world, in the OECD, in the United States, and elsewhere? And we're not seeing revolutionary dissent, or we're not seeing mobilization of the poor. And here's where I argue that racialization has been a key element. What do I mean by racialization? Racialization is a process, it's a social structure. It's based on attitudes and policies that basically render a certain people as inferior to the majority. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So the critical juncture that I sort of outline in the book really comes alongside the Industrial Revolution with the advent of where slavery picks up and becomes part of the economic structure, not only in Europe and the US, but all across the globe as well. So how does this work? Well, first, when you have racialized societies, societies that have this majority minority mark based on some kind of phenotypical or other ascriptive indicator. Typically, and in most of these societies, you have these overlapping cleavages where the minority group also overlaps with the impoverished segment of the population. So the political elite or states are able to segregate racialized minorities to minimize distribution based on a racial logic. Blacks are segregated, immigrant enclaves, religious minorities. Across the globe, we can all sort of paint this out. Typically, those segregated minorities often happen to be also the underclass. The racialization process ultimately ends up leading to the segregation of the poor from the dominant group. And so racialization directly serves to keep capital concentrated in the hands of capital or in richer areas. But there's a second part of this, which is the micro foundations or the political attitudes that sustain this. Racialization serves an important social psychological mechanism. It allows the poor of the dominant group, right? So also the problem is that what I argue in the book is that it fractures the poor. So there's not, you know, if we go back to Marx, the poor should always be united because they're all part of the same social structure and they are basically being exploited by capital. But racialization fractures the poverty, right? It fractures poverty along racial lines. So it allows the poor of the dominant group, let's say, for example, in the US, poor whites, to believe they are still superior, white privilege or supremacy, even while being economically segregated and becoming economically influenced by the entire social structure. And I reference Martin Luther King here, where he says, if it may be said of slavery era that the white man took the world and gave the Negro Jesus, then it may be said of the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. He gave him Jim Crow, and when his wrinkled stomach cried out for food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man better than the black man. So that there's a psychological mechanism at play that helps sustain, it helps fracture the poor, but also sustains the equilibrium because racialization keeps segments of the population content, even when they materially are disadvantaged by this. So racialization thus prevents collective action among poor segregated groups, and the data showing cross-national patterns and some subnational mechanisms at work in the USA and the UK. As you all know, I don't really work in the USA and the UK, but because this project required public opinion data layered over geographic data based on the census, in the US and the UK, we got the best measures. So there's some analysis from the US and the UK, but I do try to do some cross-national data testing as well. So the observable implications of the argument cross-nationally, first, societies that have an ethnic or racial cleavage are more likely to be economically segregated. That's just like, it comes out of the sort of theoretical premise of the book. And then measuring economic segregation or the degree of neighborhood homogeneity based on income, we adopt what's called the dissimilarity index. It's an index that's used by the US Census and other studies. And it basically sort of measures how much of like one class live in one area versus the other, one being the rich, the other being the poor. So we're able to capture what we call the dissimilarity index. How are you exposed to other people who come from a different class? So measuring segregation globally, how do you measure economic segregation globally when we don't have access to census data from most of the global south, right? This is where a big, huge disadvantage. And as many of you who are working in the global south know, so what we were able to do here, and this has been a long project, I'm just going to spend like 1-2 minutes on it. We benefit from all the work coming out of like development economics and international organizations like the World Bank and increasingly the UN, who have been using satellite nightlight data to measure the degree of economic development. This turns out to be a very good proxy of economic development or economic wealth in certain geographic areas especially outside the OECD, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America. So what we do basically is we subtract out the OECD and the US, and I can talk a little bit more about that. And for the rest of the Global South, we calculate based on luminosity. This is right here, Cairo, Egypt. So you see how there's variation in light. That maps onto economic wealth. Based on this, we can calculate, we took the whole population grid of the world, we created cells, then we measured economic segregation based on the lights. There's a lot of noise in this data, but it's just in the spirit of trying to see if we can establish any sort of traction on the argument. Really quickly, economic segregation, non-OECD countries, the size of the excluded population is our measure of racialized societies. So to the extent that you have a country has a minority that is excluded or treated marginally in that society, what you see is that there's a positive correlation between the degree of your excluded population, the size of that, and your level of economic segregation. So on the surface, using these nightlight data, we see sort of a positive correlation. So that gives us some traction on that argument. But the real observable implication of the argument is that this should apply to the US and the UK, two countries that have marginalized minorities. And we have very good census data that also gives us a sense of racial composition of citizens in areas so that we can calculate these economic segregation measures based on minority concentration. Long story short, I'm happy to bring this back in the Q&A. In the US, of course, we use the census data. We are able to calculate poverty status. We use the 1990 tracks with population estimates by race and poverty, and we cover the entire United States. In 1980, all metropolitan areas and some other places were covered by tracks as well. So we measure this by metropolitan areas and county level areas. For those of you working in the United States, that's an important distinction. Then we are able to, we also repeat the analysis with 2017 American Community Survey, which gives us county level analysis. A lot of controls go into this, whether it's population, the degree of urban, rural, concentration, manufacturing, percent Black, state and region fixed effects. And then we also do, we look at 4 different time periods in the context of the US. So long story short, the results here are if you basically if you have in your county areas of concentrated minorities, you also, those areas are also going to be linked to economic segregation. So it sort of substantiates the argument that where you have minorities or impoverished minorities, that's where you have economic segregation. Again, this is not new. This has all already been substantiated by sociologists and economists and political scientists working in the US. What is new here is this next slide, which is when we look at white, the economic segregation of white poor people in the United States. What you see here is that, again, if you have a county with segregated minorities, your white population, your poor white population is also more likely to be economically segregated. So it doesn't play out completely on racial lines. The marginalization of the poor also extends to the dominant group, but the poor of that dominant group, the white folks. So this of course poses the question of how is this sustained? How can societies increasingly be seeing the marginalization of poor minorities? I mean, that one we sort of understand from our own histories, right? There was a racial logic that drove racial segregation. It led to economic segregation. But now we're increasingly seeing the segregation of poor whites as well, so that this is becoming even a much more mainstream phenomena. And how is this sustained? Why is it that the white and Black poor people are not, or the white and minority people, or the dominant majority minority poor people are not coming together to collectivize against this marginalization across the world. What I argue here is that this is where we can rely on social psychology theories of downward social comparison and white privilege. So what are the implications of segregation of poor whites towards those other races? One opinion, right, tells us that when you have people from different backgrounds here, let's say the United States, poor whites and poor blacks living in the same areas, because now they're living in these concentrated areas of poverty, contact theory would have us believe that they should become more empathetic and sympathetic to one another, because now they're seeing one another, they're in the same buses, the same schools. But a second argument in social psychology theory tells us that no, social comparison theory actually tells us that poor whites will very much acquiesce to their own marginalization, because at least when they see poor blacks, they still believe that they are superior. So that contact that should have created more, it should have created more empathy and camaraderie, if you may. That contact is actually reinforcing social hierarchies, and this aura of superiority that keeps the racial cleavage alive, keeps the demobilization ongoing. So for the second option to hold and to work, for whites to consistently believe that they are superior to other minorities, even when their real world sort of income is declining, it is really contingent upon this racialization social structure, this dominant social structure where white is superior to black, to remain intact. So the test, how do we test this? For the dependent variables, I look at what's called the racial resentment attitudinal measures from the cooperative election study here in the United States, which includes racial resentment variables at the county level. I am therefore able to merge this data set with the county data set used to calculate the economic segregation scores. We can come back and talk about that. So I rely on two key dependent variables that tap into racial resentment. The first is what's called white advantage. If the propositions linked to social comparison are accurate, poor whites living in economically segregated areas, often associated with areas of high poor black concentration, should feel that whites have an overall advantage, right? So in other words, when we look at poor whites living in black areas versus poor whites living in non-black areas, are the poor whites living in black areas more likely to feel that they are racially superior? That's the first question. The second question looks at racial resentment, the extent to whether white poors living in those segregated areas are more likely to hold empathetic or non-empathetic attitudes towards blacks. And so the question that I look at here is, I often find myself fearful of people of other races. And do poor whites living with blacks, are they more fearful than poor whites not living near blacks? Individual and county level controls, long story short, poor whites living in economically segregated areas are more likely to believe in white advantage and are more likely to fear other minorities. So contact theory is not at play here. In fact, what we see is a reinforcement of superiority and fear of other minorities. And I draw on Jardina's work, who's also a Michigan PhD, who works on white identity politics. She talks about investments in whiteness in the United States. Just very quickly about why people are invested in this white category. Just some qualitative examples. I feel white people are given more privileges in the US. They make up the majority and have always been strong leaders and the wealthier class, which is where I'd like to be. So that's why I like to identify as white. I feel that as a white person, my standing in society is a little higher due to perceptions of race. Therefore, I feel a little better about myself and my overall identity. And this goes on and on. So racialization and collective action. So I've established that thus far, that societies that have racial cleavage outside of the OECD are more likely to have economic segregation. I've established, based on looking at data in the US and the UK, I showed you the US data, but it's also in the UK, that in counties or districts that have racialized minorities, those counties and districts are more likely to be economically segregated. I've also shown that poor whites who are economically segregated in these racialized areas are more likely to have attitudes that reinforce the racialized social structure, which whites feel still privileged, and fear minorities. So it sort of sustains the social equilibria around racial relations. And then finally, what about collective action? Does this pattern of economic segregation and racialization inhibit collective action? So what I do here is I rely on the global database of events, language, and tone, labor protests in the US between 2010 and 2015. So we're able to sort of map those labor protests in all of the United States in this time period to see if economically segregated areas are less likely to have protests, labor protests. So the key finding is, as white poor grow, the percent of white poor grow in economically segregated areas that are predominantly Black, the likelihood of labor protest declines. So you're not seeing collective action. So racialization serves to keep labor divided. In the context of the US, it impedes collective action. One other measure and test coming out of the OECD, another measure of labor strength and the ability of labor to mobilize is union strength, union membership among all employees in the EU and OECD countries from 1960 to 2019. That's another data source. The database on institutional characteristics of trade unions, wage setting, state intervention, and social pacts. This is a data set that you can download. Again, we're using the same sort of ethnic power relations database to measure. For a country with a median GDP in the data set, the model predicts a union density of 22% at the 90th percentile of EPR and a union density of 33% at the 10th percentile of EPR. What does this mean? A country that has more ethnic marginalization, that the majority minority gap is less likely to have a union density than a country that does not have a minority majority cleavage. So the unions are stronger in countries that are homogenous. And so this sort of comports with the argument I'm advancing. So why is economic segregation on the rise? Really quickly, there are many factors, but in this work, I want to isolate the legacies of structural racism. Shielding capital from the poor has been a continual process since states developed. The poor labor are less needed because also structural economic markets today, as we become more reliant on technology and robotics and artificial intelligence, this problem is only going to exacerbate because conventional unskilled labor is going to be no longer as essential in our societies. Racialized groups have more rights, especially after World War II in the US and elsewhere. So in other words, as racialized groups have begun to acquire their rights, the social structure, the social norms is what is really doing a lot of work today in terms of where we live, where we decide not to live. Do we want neighbors who are poor? Do we want neighbors who are minorities? Another thing exacerbating this is immigration flows. Once we substitute out domestic labor, the immigration and people who look different in our societies are living in more segregated enclaves. Immigration remains racialized as well. And this is a culmination of patterns decades, if not centuries in the making. So really quickly, my last slide, and I really thank you for your patience. People will often say, Amaney, but like this sounds, you see the data, we see the segregation. We know that the racialized social structure in our societies is alive and well. We see right-wing politicians and parties mobilizing on these platforms, but still it's painful for us to believe in these post-materialist value societies that we as societies, as elite, and I'll come back to myself, we live in Princeton. Do we really have a disdain for the poor? Are we really like sort of complicit in our daily lives, living in this equilibrium that keeps the poor segregated from our own societies? And I am reminded, and I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I am as guilty as everyone else, so I'm not trying, but here, look at, this is, and you often want to think that this happened hundreds of years ago, before we were post-materialist societies, but look at, in New York and in London, there is legislation that basically says to large-scale developers, if you want to build these like very expensive high-rises in London or New York City, you have to allocate a certain portion of the high rise, the apartments in the high rise, to poor people, because we don't want to be in a society, for all the reasons I listed, that consistently marginalizes and segregates the poor. So, with corporate real estate developers, they want to sell their multi-million-dollar apartments. People don't want to live with the poor. It decreases the value of apartments if you start all of a sudden say, oh, the poor live in the building. So here was the settlement. Here was the agreement between the developers and the cities of London and New York. We will allow for a certain number of apartments in our high rises, and this is not 500 years ago. This is in 2016 in New York City and 2014 in London, less than a decade ago. We will allow for poor to live in our buildings, but they can't come in from the front of the building because the tenants don't want to see them, the rich tenants. So they have what we call the poor doors in the alleys behind the high rises. Here's the poor door in New York, and disappearing the poor in London. Here's the London, here's the beautiful entrance, here's the lobby. Guess where the poor have to enter? From the back alley. So psychologically, societies have to sort of contend with this issue that not only is there a racial justification sometimes for this, but it's become a generalized disdain for the poor. So conclusion, capital accumulation and rising inequalities have been facilitated by racialization. The sources, consequences, and solutions to inequality policies. We spend a lot of time on inequality. Why is inequality growing in our society? What are the economic tools and levers? What policies, the social welfare state, the lack thereof? We have Piketty's Capital won the Nobel Prize on inequality. Mind you, race is not featured in this book systematically. My work brings the dimension of race and segregation and the logic that undergirds inequality as a key factor. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Amaney. It was a very impressive presentation. Okay, so we have now question and answers. Does anybody raise their hand? There was a statement by Chris Welzel, the Vice President. Chris, do you want to raise your question? And then Charlotte.
No, I just found it very fascinating, indeed. You were talking about the inequalities of opportunities, of course. I was thinking a little bit more from a civic culture perspective. And from that point of view, the spatial segregation is extremely problematic from a slightly different point of view. But this all comes together, of course, namely that it becomes increasingly difficult to build solidarity bridges, which is extremely important for finding social compromise between different socioeconomic segments of society when people are just spatially segregated between poor and rich into different parallel universes where they don't have contact anymore or intermingle anymore. But in some sense, your experiments were interesting because they kind of place important qualifications to all ports contact hypothesis. I wasn't aware of those findings. I found them very thought-provoking. More generally, this is a comment. This is a great cheer for intersectionality research. So I'm grateful to have had the privilege to hear this talk. Wonderful.
Thank you, Chris. Chris is the Vice President of the World Values Survey Association. And Charlotte, you want to ask a question? You raised your hand, but the hand is going down now. Okay, let's have a look at chat. Okay.
Yeah.
Natasha, you want to raise your question? Samir. Okay, Samir, you are here. Please raise your question, and then Natasha. Samir first, and then Natasha.
Oh, thank you, Kristen. I hope you hear me well. I sent my question in the chat, but it's good that I can just say hi to Amaney and thank you for this wonderful presentation. I just wonder, one of the global surveys that is widely spread, it's surveying the expats around the world. And one of the results that I find interesting each year, and I have been analyzing this, is some of the Kuwait countries, like some of the Gulf countries like Kuwait, they have a high raise of like unfavorable for the expats. And one of the reasons that might explain this results is that Kuwaiti as a national wealthy people live in an areas that the expats do not live there. And I wonder if that explains the high rate of racism and prejudice between the national and the expats, in regarding this, that it's the economic situation. It's not the fault of the government or the people. They just, the wealthy people live together because the housing is very high that the expat cannot afford. So that makes the prejudice is higher and increasing. Thank you.
Thank you. Amaney, you want to respond to Samir?
Yeah, so I do. Thank you so much, Samir. And you know, the expat situation is very comparable to the framework of the analysis I'm pointing out here, right? Because it's a different form of racialization in the Gulf where expats are still seen as inferior. So the argument is that anywhere a minority group is seen as inferior, and you know, and the expats are often seen as second or third class citizens in the Gulf countries, this logic will be at play. The difference there, when you look at the Gulf, is that some expat communities economically thrive in the Gulf. So there is opportunities for the expat, but you do have this lower level of expats who constitute the service labor in the Gulf, where they're sort of put in camps or residential areas far away from the population. That is that indeed is an economic segregation project that would fit in robustly into this book.
Thank you. The next speaker is Natasha and then Charlotte. Natasha, please.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for the great research, Amaney. And we actually studied together both at Michigan and then at Princeton. So it's really wonderful to see and how the World Values and the work of Professor Inglehart goes on, and this research that emerges from it. I have a question, and it's a very similar actually to the question of Samir, but it applies to Europe. Because what we see in Europe is increasing segregation, both of the poor, but also of the immigrant population, and emergence of the very right-wing and anti-immigrant sentiment that's coming from basically the poorer white population that raises their concerns more towards the marginalized groups rather than towards the, let's say, owners of the economic capital. And I was wondering how much of that research also both applies to the emergence of the right wing in Europe, and how much of that research has been done on comparing that outside of OECD countries and the EU itself.
Right. This is a very good question, Natasha. So good to see you and hear from you as well. It's been a while. Samir, I see very frequently. But Natasha, really quickly, I think, you know, this is I think an area of new research. Right, so much of the ascent of the right wing has been sort of siloed as, is it really a response to economic inequality? Is it really a response to anti-immigrant segregation? Is it really a response to economic issues? Like the right wing are always sort of responding to what's going on in their environments in Europe. Here, if we basically argue that the right wing is an engine that keeps this model at play, which means capital stays concentrated in the hands of capital. The right wing is invested in this label of majority supremacy, even while their material lives are decreasing in real objective terms. The right wing is an engine that is sustaining the segregation as well. So and the what I like to call the compounded forms of inequality that our societies are confronting right now.
Thank you, Amaney. The next speaker is Charlotte.
Hi, can you hear me now? We're good?
Yes, yes.
Sorry about this, I'm not sure what's going on. Hi, yeah, I really enjoyed the projects. I think the way in which the kinds of causal inference turn in social science, at least in political science, you know, we keep trying to test the contact theory by finding some exogenous variation thanks to some, you know, let's say refugee crisis. And we find these weird results. Why? Because, you know, these shocks are happening to societies that are in equilibrium. And so trying to understand which type of equilibrium and are they these types of inegalitarian one is super interesting. And to some extent it's so nice to see this back on the agenda. So thank you so much. So my question has to do more with understanding the social processes that might either reinforce or move a society towards kind of the type of equilibrium you're describing. And so I remember looking into these issues as an undergrad, which is a very long time ago, and the engine was actually the self-segregation of the rich, at least in French society I'd looked at, that then had these cascading effects on how the rest of the city was organized. There's been some research in the United States and some kind of pop social science on the hoarding of resources by the very rich that then has also, in the educational system, sorry, that then has these cascading effects. So I'm curious how you're thinking about the social processes. Is it actually kind of the second order effect of what's happening at the very top? Is this an interaction of preferences and market as they are currently exist? Just kind of curious, because it's not an elite with a political project. Exactly. I don't think you're arguing that, right?
So thank you so much for that, Charlotte, and really good to hear from you. Charlotte, you spent some time at Princeton several years ago as a CSD fellow, I believe.
Yeah.
Yes, so it's good to see old friends. Charlotte, really quick, this is a really good prep question. So there is a chapter in the book that basically talks about the politics underlying this. So in the book, what I talk about is that it comes out of two sort of mechanisms. One are the direct policies, right? The policies that enable, to your point, the self-segregation of the rich, the exclusivity of rich neighborhoods, and ensuring that public provisions stay limited to the self-segregated communities. And we see this with the gated communities as well. So there's that going on, but behind that are a set of policies, typically at the local level, within states that sort of exacerbate or enable and facilitate this. But I also argue about the politics of labor, you know, the retrenchment of the welfare system. I also talk about the debates about affordable housing, right? In this country, where affordable housing is always now more likely to be concentrated in poor areas. I mean, take Geneva, for example, at least anecdotally, what my friends tell me in Geneva. And I'm not like, nobody paid me to say this, but this is anecdotally, is that you can take an apartment building in Geneva, you could have the CEO of Rolex and somebody on government social services living on the same floor because of the way affordable housing is structured in Geneva. You don't see a lot of this. We're seeing, in New York, we're seeing some of it, but you have corridors now. So the idea is there has to be a social structure that allows this to say, it's okay if I'm rich and I have a poor neighbor, or it's okay that I'm rich and I don't want a poor neighbor. There's support of policy. So I talk about policies, I talk about the political decisions, I talk about the debates about redistribution. I talk about conservative parties basically calling for less redistribution in Europe, with the Republican Party calling for less redistribution in the United States. The fact that states redistribute less, or countries are redistributing less to the poor, especially in countries that have racialized minorities or immigrants, is part of now the problem.
Thanks.
Thank you. Lopamundra Ghosh, you want to ask a question?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to express my thanks and gratitude to the speaker, and also for bringing about a topic that is the need of the hour. So I'm watching from India. My question is, as I have been a student of political science, and I have read about the Frankfurt School, and also read works of some eminent Frankfurt School scholars such as Herbert Marcuse, who, according to whom, the capacity of capitalism to achieve stability by manufacturing legitimacy is a primordial concern. And the topic discussed today was about residential segregation, racial segregation. So I think capitalism has a lot to do in it. And so the question is, what should be the take to solve this crisis of racial segregation, residential segregation, and what should be the political ideology of Frankfurt scholars and conservatives with this regard, on this regard?
Thank you so much for that question. So really quick, I'm not too familiar with the Frankfurt School of thought, so I don't want to get into that. But based on what you explained, I will sort of take that on. Like, so what are is capitalism here just basically a project that is set to be delegitimated by what we're seeing because inequalities are inevitable? I think if this were a problem in all of our history, I would, and we could correlate it to capitalism, then yes, we could sort of blame capitalism. But the truth is, we've had moments in our history, not too long ago, 30, 40 years, where our neighborhoods were far more economically integrated, where labor and poorer people still live dignified lifestyles, right? A lot of this has really sort of manifested in the last 20, 30 years. So that's why we need to ask ourselves the question, what explains this variation? In my project, I argue that, well, the racialized hierarchies were always there, but as racialized minorities gained more rights, the social structure came in to ensure that, well, they have rights, but they don't have to live with us. Or we need immigrants, but they don't have to live with us, right? So there was a social structure that sustained these patterns of residential segregation that had an economic undertone to it. So then what are the remedies? Well, and I hate to say this also, but as that segregation grew, it also led to a set of economic policies that basically, to Charlotte's point, reinforced the self-segregation of the rich and exacerbated inequalities that way. So when you think about policy solutions, I think we have to, really think about the role of racialization in our societies, whether it's expats in the Arab Gulf, whether it's the Sunni-Shia divide in Lebanon, whether it's immigrants and majority in Europe, whether it's Blacks or colored people and whites in the US, a Hindu Muslim in India, right? There's no shortage of these dynamics in the world. And these dynamics are correlated with this growing phenomenon of economic segregation. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of society, and these are the questions that Ron would often ask when he lectured, Inglehart, what kind of society do we project 100 years from now? Are we going to be a society that went through a post-materialist shift in values, and then we became economically segregated, in terms of these racialized hierarchies that remained intact, that were mirrored by economic policies? So I don't think inequality can be tackled simply by thinking about it as in isolation of racial superstructures underlying it. So that's one of the biggest recommendation that comes around from here.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions, comments? I don't see it. We are here celebrating the legacy of Ron Inglehart, the founder of the World Values Survey, and I'm pleased to inform you that Wave 7 has been finished this year in India, and Wave 8 will start in January 24. So we are at the moment finalizing the questionnaire of Wave 8, and the National Science Foundation in the US has provided funding for Wave 8 in the US for the next 2 years. So America is already leading the Wave 8. And Professor John Miller from Michigan University he got this grant 2 weeks ago, and we're very pleased about this success of Michigan. And we have also several other countries who are already queuing up to start in spring next year with Wave 8. Okay, so are there any, there's still 5 minutes, any comments, questions to Professor Jamal? This seems not to be the case. Then Samir? Yes. Samir is asking about questionnaire. Very good.
I think Christian also asked a question in the chat on urban planning.
Sorry, I didn't see that.
Yeah, no, definitely,
Chris?
definitely, Christian. Urban planning is extremely important here, and especially when we think about the issue of affordable housing.
Okay. Chris, you want to comment on that?
A lot of this is happening at the local level, if I may, Christian, right? A lot of this is based on local politics, city council decisions, decisions about where you allocate affordable housing. And if, we often assume that local politics is far more influenced by the social structure.
Thank you. Okay, the Vice President, Chris Wetzel, wants to have a comment. Then Samir.
Oh, thank you, Christian. This is just a quick comment. How can we do in our survey regarding these issues to reflect these questions? I know World Values Survey, we are also part of it. We have each year developing the questionnaire, and we want to ask some questions. So I wonder in our projects about how we can reflect these great topics.
So Samad, I think you broke up, but I think what I understood is like how is there something in terms of thinking about World Values Survey development that can further capture maybe some of these opinions and how they sort of vary across economic segregation lines? I think it's important. I think the World Values Survey has excellent questions already to analyze this, but to get at whether the geographic location internally within countries, we just got to make sure that the sample sizes are large enough to do that within country analysis. I think some of that is very, very possible as is.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Okay, Chris, you want to say something?
No,
Yes.
I just Jamal answered my question perfectly well. So I was thinking about space planning and urban planning, and also, of course, affordable housing might be a key. Especially when we look at these spatial issues, which we haven't done enough in the past.
Thank you very much. So I would like to thank all of you for your questions, especially Professor Jamal for her wonderful lecture. Amaney, you want to say a last word before we switch off the meeting?
I just want to say thank you all. It's, first of all, such a great honor and pleasure, again, to be with the World Values Studies community. This is a community I hold near and dear, influence a lot of my work, but also it's such an honor to be discussing and presenting in Ronald Inglehart's series, to sort of carry his legacy and at least some of the questions. I always listened to him in the classroom. He was very much always concerned about the way modernization, GDP, affected the political culture that influenced how well we operated as societies, and very much invested in the normative good in society. So I hope this at least helps preserve that legacy moving forward.
Thank you. It was a perfect ending. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. The video of this presentation will be on the website via Zoom. You can see it again. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.